Today's episode is brought to you by the FAM Certification Program. FAM is the training program you've been waiting for. Designed exclusively for women's health professionals, FAM gives you the tools to not only teach fertility awareness to your clients, but to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool in your practice. FAM is the only program that will equip you to start teaching your clients within a manageable 9-month timeframe. We cut out all of the fluff and focus entirely on the skills you need to master to support your clients. There's no program like it anywhere. We'll be starting in early 2024. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMLive to join the waiting list and be the first to know when registration opens up again. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 493. Today's episode is all about birth, and it's certainly one of my favorite topics. For those of you who may not know, I have 3 children and birthed all of them in my home. And so I found today's interview particularly interesting because my guest, Allison Yarrow, had a very different experience of her first birth. And it was such a profound experience for her that she wrote a whole book about the issues around birth and hospitals and medicine. And that is exactly what we are talking about today. So before we jump into today's episode, let me share a little bit about Allison. Allison Yarrow is an award-winning journalist, speaker, and author of Birth Control: The Insidious Power of Men Over Motherhood and 90s Media Culture and the Failed Promise of Gender Equality. She was a TED resident, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vox, Insider, USA Today, Time, and Newsweek. And in case you're wondering, she has a really interesting play on the words birth control. So unlike the type of birth control we're usually talking about on this podcast, which would be hormonal contraceptives, she's actually using that play on words to talk about the control over birth as a concept and what her experience was like and how it really led her to question this whole industry around birth. So let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. Okay, and I'm here today with Allison Yarrow. I'm really excited to talk about her brand new book, Birth Control: The Insidious Power of Men. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Allison.
Thanks for having me. So happy to be here.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, and huge congratulations about your new book. We were just talking in the pre-chat about what an accomplishment that is, and I would love to bend your ear on how the process went, because it's always very interesting what is necessary to bring a book into the world. So I would love to start by just having you share a little bit about yourself, what you do, and also what inspired you to write this book now.
I am a journalist and a mother of 3. And what inspired me to write Birth Control was my experiences with pregnancy and childbirth. I had covered abortion policy for years and sort of understood the landscape of reproductive health and the ways in which our systems deny that to people. And yet, when I became pregnant for the first time, I sort of imagined that birth was kind of sacrosanct or just not subject to the same kinds of systemic sexism and racism that I was actually writing about in very related but other areas. And that naivete sort of carried into my own understanding of what I was experiencing. I really began to research pregnancy and birth as if it were a story I was reporting. And what I found was, in taking a Bradley method class with my partner to prepare for birth, which is the Bradley method is the partner coached method of childbirth, I realized that what we were learning in these sort of 8 weeks of intensive focus on pregnancy and birth, in addition to learning what happens in your body during birth, which is what I wanted to understand, I wanted to know what labor felt like, we were learning about how to defend ourselves against what was being offered in the hospital. And that sort of sent my, journalist red flags just kind of everywhere. Like, this is what is happening. What is this? And so that really I knew at that moment that this was something I wanted to explore further, and it would take some years until I got there. But, at the outset of writing this book, I surveyed 1,300 women and birthing people about their experiences with pregnancy and childbirth to understand if this was sort of my own experience or if it was broader. And really what I found is that childbirth in America is broken. And that's for many reasons, but I think the central one is that we have a managed care model, which means that many people who are giving birth in the hospital, where about 99% of people do give birth, are being taken care of by just a few people. So the effort and the goal is on moving those birthing people through the hospital as quickly as possible. And that means that they're not always getting the best quality of care, and they're certainly not always experiencing care that's based in evidence or that centers them as the experts. And that's really what birth control is about.
There's so much there. This is going to be a very interesting conversation. There's a lot of things. I was taking a few notes. I'm always taking notes so that I kind of remember the things as we go through the interview. But I think the first thing that came to mind when you said that when you were taking your Bradley course, that you found yourself learning how to defend yourself against the medical model. My whole birth strategy was that. So what I always say, half jokingly, and right, there's always a seed of truth, in the jokes, was, so for anyone who doesn't know, or maybe any new listeners, I had all three of my children in my house. So they were all born. My son was born in his bedroom, my eldest, and then my youngest son and daughter were born in the kitchen in birthing tubs. And my daughter is a year at the time we're recording this. So there was a recent birthing tub experience. And the whole point in many ways of this choice was to put me as far away from the medical interventions as possible. So it was least likely for me to need them. And part of it's because I'm a chicken in many ways, and maybe it's kind of interesting because it's I'm going to choose unmedicated birth, right? Because a lot of people, that would be the thing that they're the most scared of, but I'm the most chicken about the surgical interventions. That's always been something where I'm well, if I need them, I'm happy that they're available, but I would love to not need them. So let me put myself as far away from that as possible. Anyway, so what was I suppose what's interesting to me about this is that it seemed like it was new information to you. So maybe talk a little bit about that, because I've known about this since I was very young. I had made that decision to home birth when I was probably 18 or 19.
I'm always so fascinated when I meet people like you who had that knowledge so early. I feel like you have to sort of be in a community or an educational environment where that's supported, where you're considered to be the expert in your body, and it's known that birth is a physiological experience in the body, not a procedure in the hospital. But I was afraid, and I didn't know anyone who had experienced home birth. I met someone, and I write about it a little bit in the book, who sort of a colleague whose wife gave birth at home in a bathtub. And it was the first time I'd ever heard of that. I must have been, just out of college. I was an adult. And I remember thinking, is that crazy? Is that correct? What is that choice? I really had no frame of reference for it. And then as I became old enough to have my own children, I was afraid. I had internalized a lifetime of narrative about how childbirth is dangerous and medicine is safe. And that's everywhere, from our literature to our films and television to what you hear when you become pregnant and you go to the traditional resources that exist. And so I really had to sort of fight back my own personal gaslighting to get to my home birth, right? So I had 2 births in the hospital and 1 at home. My last child was born at home. None of them were medicated. They were all vaginal, unmedicated. But I needed to be able to get there. And I think in a way, Birth Control is a book that wants to get people there faster, because what I learned and what I understand now is that all of these, interventions in the hospital, we're told that we need them. We're told that we need them by experts with degrees and acronyms and prowess and authority. And when you look at the evidence, when you look at the science, most of us don't need them, right? So everything from you walk into the hospital in labor and they want to do a pelvic exam to admit you, and then it's like, let's strap you to this electronic fetal monitor. Let's get Pitocin, synthetic oxytocin going to speed up your contractions or to get them started, to you're taking too long. Let's do surgery, or like, it's time for dinner. I'm ready to go home. Like, let's do surgery. It's none of it is based in any good evidence. It's all about moving people through the system as quickly as possible to pad out profit, and also to avoid litigation. Because as you know, 1OB put it to me, like, the only C-section you get sued for is the one that you don't do. So this is baked in. This is why a third of people giving birth in this country are doing so through abdominal surgery. And we know that that's too high. And we know that that's connected to the maternal mortality crisis that we are facing. That is far worse for Black women than it is for white women. And we know that C-section increases the risk of hemorrhage, of sepsis, of hypertension, of things that are the leading causes of maternal mortality. And so it isn't, I get into this discussion a lot. I mean, it's not just sort of about personal preference, right? It's about safety, and it's about what really is an experience and a process that most people can do without the aid of all of this technology.
Yeah, I mean, I would second obviously what you said. I mean, it's really interesting to think about. So when you were kind of sharing, I suppose, the difference between our perspectives. So you're right. I have known about this and just for a very long time. And so I didn't have to brainwash myself out of years of not knowing it. And so being part of the fertility awareness world at a very young age obviously exposed me to the concept of the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in my very, late teens, early 20s. And so that has a profound effect on how you look at the world, especially when you discover that at a young age. And also, I haven't had the luxury to trust the medical establishment to the degree that I think maybe the average person does. And it's for a lot of different reasons. I mean, I share some personal stories that I've had with just like straight up doctor incompetence. Like the times when I was a little kid, there was one time when I had like a bladder infection, but this doctor gave me some crazy antibiotics that made me vomit. Like, so stuff like that, and I was a little kid, it made an impact. There was a time that the doctor told me to come back. I was having some abdominal pain. And so enough so that my mom took me to the doctor, and the doctor told me to come back at 4 so that he could take out my appendix, and I was ovulating. So like my mom took me to the pediatrician in the big city who told me I was ovulating. Right. So like there's that stuff, and I could go on for hours about all the times that I've had experiences where, and then there's now as a professional, I could also go on for hours with the number of clients who have the stories, and some of the information obviously is on the podcast as well, where it's like, yeah, they told me I needed to come and get this surgery, and it turns out I didn't have the thing, right? Or whatever it is. And so there's that piece of it. But when I was thinking about, okay, so why did I know this specific thing? Because I can remember, I don't know if I've probably mentioned this on the podcast, because after the years of, it's always, it's the same history that I'm sharing here, but I can remember having a conversation with one of my best friends who's a labor and delivery nurse. And like, right, like we're like really young. Neither of us are trying to have a baby today, but we're like having this like very, what would you say, spirited discussion where I'm saying to her, like, no, I'm good. Like, I'm going to have a baby in my house, and this is what we're going to do. Like, I'm not trying to like get a C-section. And she was saying, she's like, well, I would love to do that. Like, I want to be as natural as possible, but she worked at a high risk hospital. And so she actually saw some of the patients who do have, whether it's weight issues or whether it's preeclampsia or diabetes, like the people were sent to her hospital when they had the risk factors. And so the only experience that she had with home birth was when it went wrong. And like they ended up at the hospital, right? So she actually was predisposed against it. And I remember we had these conversations, and she ended up having her first baby in the hospital. I'm pretty sure she had the rest of them at home because she eventually kind of came around. And I read this book in my early 20s. I still have it, I think, called Misconceptions. And that was really what like solidified that for me. And it helped me to understand exactly what you're saying. Because what you're saying is, okay, the majority of births don't require, and like this, it's so interesting because it's just silly. The majority of births are low risk. And like, it's interesting. Like you probably, like, I'm guessing you had to be deprogrammed, but and I had to deprogram my husband because when I first told him I wanted to have a baby in the house, he was like, say what now? But it's like, no. Like, it's not like you're just like at home and like someone throws a bone and like does some incense. Like the people who come to your house are trained professionals. And we have all of these screening tools prior to the birth where they can confirm if you are low risk or not. Like there's all these checks and balances to make sure that if you're at home, it means that like you're supposed to be at home. And there's people who are not able to have birth at home, and that kind of stuff is caught, right? So I'm going to stop going on about this, but I'm finding this to be super fascinating.
Yeah, education and how we are educated about all of this is so important. And I think really begins when we are young, when we're beginning to understand. I mean, the work that you do, our menstrual cycles for the first time or not, right? So I opened the book, the chapter, Welcome to Pregnancy, with a conversation that I had with 3 10-year-old girls in Brooklyn, because I wanted to understand what is the sex education and the ovulatory cycle education that you are getting now. I grew up in Georgia and I had abstinence only education. And it was during the height of the AIDS epidemic. And so it was a very particular kind of education that I was getting. I did not know anything about my menstrual cycle. When I did my survey for the book, about almost 30% of people who I surveyed, like me, did not know that you could only become pregnant a few days a month before they tried to become pregnant. And that's really important information to know all the time, not only when you're actually pursuing motherhood or parenthood. So I wanted to understand what these girls knew. And we live in a pretty progressive place, and they're in very progressive school, and they're very smart. But the way that they were educated, I mean, really what they took away from this talk was that puberty meant that both boys and girls, people with penises, people with vaginas, would have stuff that comes out, quote. And for boys, it was going to be like semen, and it was going to feel good, and it was going to be relaxing, and it was a thing to be celebrated. And for girls, it was going to be blood, and it was going to be messy, and they were going to have to clean it up, and they weren't going to have access to like the products that they needed at school necessarily. You like had to go to the nurse to get menstrual products. It wouldn't just be in the bathroom. So it was this sort of moment of potential shame, and they worried about people finding out that they had this experience, this change, and that they might be seen differently because of it. And it just broke my heart. And I also I was so pregnant when I was interviewing them. And it was like my belly was obviously like very pregnant. And we didn't really talk about that and the connection between knowing, not knowing about your ovulatory cycle, and one day wanting to become a parent and needing that information. And so it just really drove home for me the fact that whether we're talking about sex education or access to abortion or birth, it's all important that we are considered the experts in our own bodies, and we're given the tools and the power to have that expertise throughout our lives.
I feel like I'm stuck on the example that you gave for the kind of 10-year-old girls, because in my mind, when you said, like, when you kind of made that comparison, there's nothing analogous to menstruation in men. There's nothing, right? There's nothing because like, right, like male-bodied individuals, like, right, like males do not have babies. Like they don't, so there's no men's, like there's nothing analogous. Like, so this is the true comparison would be the kind of release of fluids that can potentially happen in women, like arousal fluid and right, like that would be the actual analogous event in females, which would
And that
be,
was not broached.
and that's not a thing that's ever talked. Obviously, it's not.
Right.
I mean,
no,
I didn't learn
pleasure?
about that.
What?
Yeah, like I remember when I was in university, I went to a talk and it was called an orgasm talk, and I dragged my roommates. I'm like, they're doing orgasm talk. But it was interesting because this like PhD individual that was in a room full of people, right? Because we all came to an orgasm talk, and then but she was the one. Like I was like, oh my gosh, like there's the female ejaculation, like what? Like this is the thing.
And even masturbation, they were taught about masturbation, but only for boys. Yeah. I brought that up with them and they said, girls masturbating, like what? Like what is that even? But any, I think, responsible sex education would not lead them to make this comparison.
But is it sex education though? So like, I just want to float an idea out there. I mean, why are they really doing this education? You know what I mean? I had this conversation either on another podcast interview or with a client this week. And so it's like, we talk about these things. And of course, as women, we feel like we have been robbed of important information, and it's, they should be teaching us this stuff. But like this is just my opinion. I'm just gonna put this out there. I want to hear what you think about it. I don't think that they do this to educate us. I think they do this to ensure that we can smooth over this difficult time, like to make it easier for the teachers and educators in the school and stuff. Because if you have girls who don't, because the teachers must know that there's a percentage of the girls in the school that have never heard of periods. And so how terrible, right, for them to have these girls who are bleeding all over the place and don't know how to do anything about it. I feel like the reason that they do this so-called sex education has nothing to do with sex or education, but this is my opinion. But I feel like it's to do with like the practical aspect of like, well, they're going to start bleeding soon, so we need to tell them to make sure that they're like, they mop it up basically. And then the boys are going to start to have erections and stuff. And like, so anything that could affect their life in school, I feel like they bring it up and talk about it just to kind of like, okay, now y'all are aware. And so now we can continue to go about our, anyways, what do you think about that? Because I feel like this is the reason, like, and if we're connected to why they're doing it, I think it's a very practical reason, like ultimately why this is done. So they're not trying, in my opinion, to educate like, I feel like it shows like, it's just, that's not their idea. That's not their goal. But what do you think?
There's been so much money over time from states and the federal government that's gone toward, quote unquote, sex education in schools. That's abstinence only. There are, I found in my research, like many kind of period product companies are sponsoring this kind of education, right? They have a ready-made sort of packet of information that teachers can grab and here you go. Here's how to, take care of a period. Here's what a period is, like, sponsored by, whatever company it is. And so that's not ideal, right? That's not really what we want to see.
Like, that's not for the betterment of women and to ensure that we understand our cycle. I guess the way that I look at it is probably just very cynical and maybe even like a little bit like extra, right? But I'm because especially from the fertility awareness angle, that's the last thing on anyone's mind. They have no desire to help us, to empower us, to understand our like, that's not what they're doing here. And maybe if we understood that, then we could like, you know what I mean? Like, I just feel like,
yeah, no, I agree with you.
So I'm like in your camp by the fact that like, because I'm generally irritated like all the time about the lack of health care information and sex ed information, to the point that it's like, okay, like at what point do we just stop even expecting them to do anything useful? And then it's inconvenient, but like they're not doing it anyways. Like, what do we do to get the information out there? They're obviously not going to do it. I don't even think it crosses their mind that the goal should be to provide a thorough sex education for young people.
Well, I think what I'm trying to kind of illustrate in the book and in this chapter and writing about that, I agree with you. You're 100% right. It's falling short on by every measure, by absolutely every measure. But I think what some sex educators like said to me when I interviewed them was that if you're in a low resource school where the option is you can grab this packet sponsored by a period company and you can give people some information versus nothing, like that's preferable, right? But what would be optimal is what you're describing, which is just like fully comprehensive education about ovulatory cycles, about fertility awareness method, about all the things that could put the power in your hands. Now, is that the job of a school? I don't know. I think our society really should be more supportive of all of this. And I think, to be honest, if you look at these school environments, I mean, many schools, most of the teachers are women, right? The administrators are women. And these are not necessarily women who understand these things for ourselves. I mean, many adults don't understand ovulatory cycles, that you can only get pregnant a few days a month, what it means to actually be on hormonal birth control, that you actually aren't menstruating when you're on hormonal birth control. These are things that adult human beings still don't know. So of course, it's going to be really difficult for us to impart this really valuable, essential knowledge to our kids. But I think it's important that we figure out a way to do it, because when we become pregnant, some 9 out of 10 women globally will become mothers. So we need to understand these foundational ideas to deprogram ourselves from relying on a broken medical system that is coercing and abusing many of us as we give birth to our children.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I'm not trying to be difficult, but I'm just cynical, right? And we're totally on the same page. And you bring up an important point, and of course I've thought about that as well. I mean, is the grade 2 math teacher like qualified, right, to teach? Did they even sign up for that? Is that like this, right? So there's all of these questions, and I'm all about solutions. And so I say it on the podcast all the time. I say it's up to us, and I mean it, to do it, to teach. And even as a parent now, with putting my children in school, is it the school's job to teach these things to students, right? Because there's all these different people, there's all these different religious, cultural, political viewpoints, and you put everyone in one school, and regardless of what they do, someone is going to be upset. There's certain things that they could teach or not teach my children that I would be upset about. And those exact things might be exactly what someone else wants their children to be taught. So I think it's really complicated, this whole, especially as a parent, because whose job is it? Whose job is it to teach the kids about this? I mean, obviously I've taken it on to be my job, right? I'm not going to leave my children to whatever the school decides to teach them. I'm not interested. I don't have faith that they're going to impart some deep wisdom onto my kids about sexual anything, really, let alone, how the cycle works or anything like that. It's definitely a difficult thing, but you have a very important point, like you said, when you were interviewing the educators themselves, who said, well, if this is how we're going to do it through the sponsorship, and this is our way in, and even if we can't provide full comprehensive information for us to be able to provide something, I do think that there's obviously value in that as well. I'm sure you've contemplated this quite a bit. What do you think there's no answer, right? But like, as a parent yourself, what do you think is the solution? I would imagine that regardless of what they teach your children, it's probably not going to be enough.
What I would love to see is adult women and people who can and want to give birth have authority and agency over their own bodies. It's not our job to fix a broken system, but knowing that the system is broken is important information for us, so that we can, because I don't think that's widely known, right? I think, you, like many people I would say that I've interviewed, and like me, go into the birth experience thinking, I'm choosing a provider. I trust that person. I'm choosing a hospital. 99% of us do. And that's the place. And I'm going to go into this listening to them and to that and to protocol and we're not taught by school or society or even necessarily our parents to question authority, certainly not in a healthcare setting, right? And yet, what I would like to see is women to take back that authority and to understand that the body is powerful, that we've been giving birth since, time immemorial, and we can do that without being pushed around, and we can have the people we want in the space when we do it. And hopefully we have providers who believe that also, who believe in the power of the birthing body, so that if we are told that we have preeclampsia, we need to have surgery, we have one of the rare conditions that require a surgical birth, that we can trust that authority, that we're in partnership with our providers. I think that's the solution. Part of, I'm sure, many things.
Popping into today's episode with a quick question. Do you like paper charting? Today's episode is brought to you by the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook. This is the first beautifully designed, fully customizable paper charting workbook designed with you in mind. With 3 years worth of charting pages, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook has you covered. If you've been looking for a solid alternative to charting apps, you'll love this charting workbook. The FAM Charting Workbook is available in both Fahrenheit and Celsius editions and is available in spiral-bound, paperback, and ebook versions. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/workbook to order your copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/workbook. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. Do you think, and so this is where my cynicism comes out. This is where it comes out. Because I find myself, so as you're talking about this, I find myself thinking, is it really possible? And I think the reason that I say that is, if for anyone, again, who's kind of a newer listener, just have a listen to my Pill Reality series. I've been doing this podcast thing for 9 years, and I've talked to so many women behind the scenes that you never hear from on air. And I hear story after story of just women not being listened to, not being heard, given the wrong medication, sometimes given the wrong it's completely mad, really. I question, is there really going to be a time when we could give up our authority or trust the authority to, and I'm at the point where I don't like the concept of giving over those decisions or any of that to authority. I like the idea of, I always talk about my boardroom analogy where, you have the different health professionals who specialize in their own fields, and they are contributing to your knowledge and information. They're, educating you, providing you with their expertise and knowledge and recommendations based on their particular modality, but that you are ultimately the one to make that decision, that they are not the ones to make the decision.
Exactly.
I feel like I would never be comfortable with this person did their whatever degree, and so I'm just going to do what they said. I think that they should be a contributor. I think depending on their expertise and their experience, you should take what they have to say quite seriously. But ultimately, I don't think we should be giving up our power to anybody, because they haven't proven that they are worthy of that. Just talk to 10 women randomly about reproductive anything and right?
One of the most shocking findings that I uncovered while researching this book was about birth trauma. And the nurse and researcher Cheryl Beck has studied this for decades, and she's found that about 45% of people describe their birth experience as traumatic, and that about tracks with my survey respondents too. And that's really high. That's incredibly high, right? So we have to figure out how that cannot be the case. And if following the instruction of the expert is the path to birth, and 45% of people are being traumatized, and our maternal mortality rate is, the highest in the developed world, climbing the highest it's been in our lifetimes. This is not the way to go. I agree with you. I believe that people giving birth are the experts in their bodies, and everyone else is there to listen first and to advise with their own expertise. I trusted my doula and my home birth midwife implicitly, but I didn't have that experience with the first midwife that I gave birth with, and then the second practice of OB and midwives that I gave birth with. I did not have the same experience. And it shaped my experience. And being in labor is, I mean, it's perhaps our bodies are at their most powerful and mightiest, but at the same time, there's an element of vulnerability, and it's difficult to advocate for yourself when you're in labor. And by that point, you shouldn't have to be fighting off intervention you don't want, right? You should be in collaboration with your provider. So I think that, we are the experts. That is the be all end all. And until we're seen that way, nothing will change.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is such a powerful conversation. I feel like it's something that, oh, you know what? It came back to me. So the question that I had for you, because you interviewed so many people, right? Now you said 40% of the births were traumatic. Now, are these women identifying it as such? I guess the question out of it is that the process of birth in a hospital, to me, in and of itself, is traumatic. The whole thing for a lot of, I mean, this is also, keep in mind as a listener that I have only had home births. So for example, when I speak to anybody who's given birth in a hospital, anybody, and they share with me their story, they don't identify it as traumatic necessarily. But when I'm listening to, and then they had to give me the Pitocin, and then they had to and then and then and whatever, and they did the episiotomy, and didn't really right? Like whenever I'm hearing, even if it's like fine and right, like you're also hearing it often like well after it took place, when the person has already kind of dealt with the initial feelings that they may have had right after. So the question that I have is, are the women themselves identifying that it was traumatic, or are we at a point where we have fully normalized this kind of method of birthing without even really understanding how traumatic it is, and that it doesn't have to be that way?
The research on birth trauma specifically asks about that. So the people answering those questions have identified their birth as traumatic, both in my survey and in Beck's survey. I think the number is much higher because you're right. The process of birth in a hospital is inherently traumatic in lots of fundamental ways. Something that Beck found that I find incredibly fascinating is that birth trauma is more likely to occur, not because of a style of birth, not if you have a surgical birth versus a vaginal birth, but if you feel left in the dark. The way that her survey respondents put it is, many of them said, I felt raped on the table. Everyone was watching and nobody offered to help. So if you have the feeling that you don't understand what's happening to your body and you aren't being supported by those around you, perhaps they're strangers, perhaps there's noise and light streaming in your face, you're more likely to experience birth trauma. If, on the other hand, you are centered in your own experience, you understand what's happening, you're feeling adequately supported, you're much less likely to appraise your birth as being traumatic. And I think that that's really important to understand the distinction and the causality there. And also, something that we do not bake into our birthing culture is storytelling, is processing. We don't talk about our births. People are not asked to tell their birth story. I asked about this in my survey, and others have done this too. I mean, we're not asked, right? And then many times we fear telling the story because we don't want to make anybody else feel bad, or we don't want to sort of impose our own experiences during birth onto somebody else's experience who hasn't had a birth yet. Something that was incredibly valuable for me after my home birth was writing it down, talking about it with my midwife when she came back for postpartum care and doing that processing together. I think some of the best midwives do this. They come back for care, for physical assessment, mental assessment, and you talk about what was good, what was bad, what was hard, what went wrong. And it's a moment where you can, as the birthing person, really process what happened. But there's no opportunity for that in the hospital. It would be a very rare thing for someone to be able to have that opportunity to process. And we know that that kind of appraisal and processing also reduces trauma.
Well, and in the hospital setting, I would imagine it's similar to something you said earlier, which was you said something along the lines of the only C-section that you get sued for is the one you don't do. So there's also this idea kind of very that if anything goes wrong, they're going to sue me. So you can't then sit around and talk about your feelings of what went good and what went bad, because then you're putting yourself up for potential liability, like to a lawsuit and stuff. So that just isn't, when you said something about the system being inherently broken and people not knowing that, I mean, it is. And there's no space for that conversation when you can't even say anything because you might be sued, right? So the whole thing is already set up to be adversarial. And that's, I would imagine that if many women sit down and think about what and I'm saying women specifically because not that men don't experience the same kind of thing, but I mean, I spend my days talking to women about their experiences, right? And it feels very adversarial. I mean, literally, like yesterday, my mom went to the doctor to try to ask for a blood test and she left without the blood test, because it's an adversarial. Every time you go into the doctor to ask for anything, it's like you had to go in guns blazing, you got to bring a friend, you have to have a plan of what you're going to say and call a friend and all this kind of stuff. I've had so many doctors on the podcast who provide like step-by-step instructions for what to do. Like you literally asking for a test, you know what I mean? So what you said as well, like we need to be aware of essentially what we're up against. And if you're not, and you go in there thinking, okay, this is what everyone does, and the doctors know what they're doing, and we're just going to go have a lovely birth, and thousands of women give birth every day, and I'm just going to, right? If you don't know what you're up against, then yeah, it's very difficult. The first step is educating women so that we know what we're walking into and we know what is really happening. So we know how to advocate for ourselves. And the hardest thing in the world is that it's not even fair that we should even have to. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you should be able to just, like, you're the one who went to medical school. You spent like $8,000, like, right? Like, you got the thing on the wall that little plaque is worth like $100,000. Like, and I have to go in there and like, I have to do my research and I have to know what's going on. I have to ask for all stuff. I have to, right? It's all on me. And you're supposed to be the one. I'm supposed to be able to go in there and I'm supposed to be able to trust what you're going to tell me. I'm supposed to be able to trust that when you give me advice, it's for my best good, not because you want to go home and get off early or whatever. Like, right. So it's very difficult and it's very unfair, but what's the solution? Right. So, I mean, obviously your book is your way of kind of like putting it out there, like, look, right. But what do you say to that? Because I find it to be necessary, unfortunately, for us to have to advocate for ourselves. But I also just deeply aware of how just completely ridiculous that is and unfair that just regular lay women with no medical expertise are the ones that have to take the reins and really become, because yes, I might be an expert in my own body in the sense of like what I am feeling, but I'm not necessarily like the average woman is not necessarily a medical expert to have the terminology to explain the way that it, right? It's completely unfair and unreasonable, but this is literally what we are up against.
I find it empowering to know that birth can be very simple and that the birthing body actually needs like very simple things to enable it to give birth, right? This idea from the obstetrician Robert Bradley, who grew up on a farm watching animals give birth. And he said, the birthing body needs 6 things. It needs darkness, needs quiet, closed eyes, relative privacy, physical comfort, and controlled breathing. That's what the birthing body needs. And guess what's completely denied in the hospital? All of those things. And yet, if you know that, if you know what, actually my body just needs these very basic things, I find that it's incredibly empowering and gives women the opportunity to just rethink what's going on in there. I mean, when you have a profession that evolved, because men went to medical school in Europe and came back to America and wanted to learn how to attend birth because like that's what the midwives were doing and that's the kind of healthcare people needed. And then slowly with tools and drugs and arts stole that away from midwives. The first thing they learn in medical school is how to do a C-section. They don't attend physiologic birth. They don't understand what physiologic birth looks like, what it sounds like. And what became apparent to me as I was giving birth and making noise, doing the kinds of things that my doula, advised and I read about and vocalizing during my labor, I could see how scared they were of me. I could see how the position my body was in, the way I sounded, how terrifying it looks to people who are not aware that that's what birth looks like. But if we know that, I mean, that to me, these things are not expensive, right? Like it's not expensive to have the lights off or to know that vocalization helps move the baby down. Like these are things that anybody can do and are accessible. And I'm also encouraged by a new kind of conversation that's happening. It's not causing the kind of change as fast as I want to see it, and you probably want to see it. But we know the midwifery model of care, which considers the birthing person, the woman, the expert in her body. Birth is a physiologic process that we support. That model and doulas, there is tons of evidence about how these things prevent C-sections, reduce trauma, increase people's positive appraisals of their own birth. Lactation is way up, mental health is way up. All the evidence points to this model. The CDC just released a study about rampant mistreatment in maternal health care. But what the leaders at the CDC said was doulas, was midwifery model of care. We know these things will help lower the maternal mortality rate. So we know the evidence is there for the things that we know. I mean, it kind of is annoying that we even need the evidence, right? Because it's so obvious that these things work, but they're there. And because we know these things. So I'm very encouraged when I get on a press call with the officers at the CDC who've just put out this big study and they're saying doulas and they're saying midwifery model of care. And they're saying we understand that these elements, that this will help us fix the maternal mortality crisis. But what I now want to see is we know this. Let's see that model. Right? Let's see that model in the hospital. It's going to be difficult to get 99% of birthing people out of this environment, but let's bring the kind of care that they actually need, that is centers us as human beings and is life-saving. Let's get that kind of care in the place where we are. Or let's use our consumer voice, our consumer power, and give birth somewhere else.
Yeah, I feel like, again, I keep going back to like being cynical because I've spoken to so many women as well who see nothing wrong with the way that birth is done and are thrilled to be able to schedule their C-sections. And not that there's anything wrong with that either, but in the sense of like, if we're free for choice, then everyone needs to be able to choose that, right? So we have to be supportive of all of the choices, even if they're different to ours, right? But because I chose to give birth at home 3 times, I became deeply aware of how weird I am compared to basically everyone I know, right? So other than my select few friends who might choose a similar route, like everyone I know is just not choosing that and is not interested in it and is loving having the option to be medicated and to right, like all the things that maybe you and I would question are thrilled to have those types of options. So I think I've always felt like education is the biggest piece. So I love that you've created this resource for women to explore what's really going on, especially for those who've never really questioned the system. And becoming a parent is such an interesting experience in so many ways. And I think between the fertility journey that many women unexpectedly face, plus becoming a mother and becoming face to face with some of the ways that our system doesn't serve us, can be just a really excruciating experience to learn that, wait a minute, I thought all these individuals had my best interests at heart. So I wanted to go back to the subtitle of your book because I want to ask about it. The insidious power of men over motherhood, right? Like it's super, what's the word? It's like kind of provocative, right? Because you're throwing the patriarchy right on the cover. You're like, look. So maybe share with us a little bit about that, as we start wrapping up today. Like, what I feel like you're a lot more hopeful than me. I don't know if that's good or bad. Not that I'm not hopeful. I feel like my cynicism leads me to believe that the solution is not within the institutions, but without.
I think that's a smart position to take. This subtitle, The Insidious Power of Men Over Motherhood, really nods to the systemic patriarchy and white supremacy that have created the birthing system that we have today. And this is not my opinion. The book is full of evidence that points to this. Everything from the way that obstetrics evolved in this country, white men coming back from medical school, as we talked about earlier, or I can just say that we talked about earlier, white men coming back from studying medicine in Europe and setting up practice and learning birth from midwives and eventually stealing their patients and offering tools and drugs and arts and eventually hospitals, which they promised were safer than giving birth at home, which was what had been happening in America for many, many years. And we know from evidence that many births were successful. And it was a tradition among women. Women gave birth. Women attended each other's births. From the time you were a little girl, you were helping out with birth. You were seeing it. It was part of the narrative, part of the language. People did it many times. And that was really taken away from women. And now birth is attended by a system created by people who never have and never will give birth. And I find that curious. And it isn't meant to be this way. The mistrust of birthing bodies is patriarchal. It comes from not understanding the experience of living and being in that body. And now it's really interesting, actually. Obstetrics is becoming much more female dominated than it ever has been before. But it isn't about the gender of the provider. It's about the system. And the system was created in this patriarchal mold. And so those women who are still practicing in the system, who did residency in the system, it's violent. Right? I mean, those who I interviewed about this, it's violent being trained in this system. And the system is patriarchal. And so I think to untangle this and to return the power to the people who need to have the power, we have to acknowledge that. I mean, that's like step one for many, many more steps to come.
Well, and my cynicism goes to the money also, because as much as we could talk about the race of the doctors, it's like there's a huge pharmaceutical benefit for all things that require intervention. And there's a lot more money to be made when you have to use surgical interventions. There's a lot more money to be made when you have to use the various drugs that are available for this process. I feel like I'm sure that you address that part of it as well. Again, the cynicism. What I see with the birth control industry, that it's like a $30+ billion industry. There's some interesting reading material for anyone who's like nerdy like myself. And I remember researching the birth control chapter for one of my books. And in there, I found it was kind of like a pamphlet for doctors. Pamphlet is not the right word, but it was kind of like a booklet for doctors. And it had all the recommendations for the different birth control methods and et cetera. But the reason I'm bringing this up and using it as an example is because it had something recommended from menarche to menopause. And then after menopause, they have other stuff to recommend, right? So it's always about, again, going back to my question, like, is this about making life better for women? Like, right? Like, is this about helping us be healthier? Like, no, it's not. Like, right? Like, no, it's not. And so when it comes to the birth and the system and the process that they're recommending to us, is it about ensuring that we have the best possible experience? Like, no, it's not, right? So if we get clear on what this is about, which is about ensuring that these companies and corporations make a lot of money, then I feel like it helps us to understand where we stand in this. But that's just my opinion, right? Like that's how I look at it. Like, and I really feel very cynical. I feel like you're more hopeful than me. And I would like some of that to rub off on me.
I was really fascinated to learn that, well, first of all, we know that labor and delivery and NICU too are the most, I mean, just the most costly things that happen in hospitals. And yet, people going to hospitals to give birth are not sick, are not injured, right? They're coming in, but they don't need what hospitals offer, which is, heroism and care and taking care of sickness and injury. But I learned that we give birth in hospitals in labor and delivery wards, specifically these rooms, because they are associated with a fee. They can be converted into surgical suites. So even if you don't need surgery, hospitals want to put you in a surgical suite, a labor and delivery room to give birth. And if the hospital is crowded, which was, one of my experiences was we got there and triage was full, the rooms were full. I labored in the lobby for a while. And I wondered, and many others maybe who've had this experience too, perhaps wonder, why can't we just be put in another room? This is a huge building full of rooms. Why can't I go to another room? And you can't go to another room because they can't bill for that rate there. They can't bill for the surgical suite. So they want to put you in the room that they can bill the higher rate for. And this is reality. And yes, C-sections range in cost from a few $1,000s to $60,000 or $80,000, according to one study. So that's also a very costly procedure. But really where the earning comes, where the money comes, is moving people through as quickly as possible, getting them in these rooms where you can charge a higher premium and getting birth under control on a clock with all of the not evidence-based interventions to move people through as quickly as possible. Because the more people you can move through the hospital, the more money you can make.
Well,
my cynicism is showing, but it's really it's based in evidence.
I've rubbed off on you, but just kidding. Just had to make the joke there. But no, it's just so sad, right? But I guess the reason that we're having this conversation is there is hope. Like even between my cynicism and your cynicism, there is hope. And I love the message that you've been super consistent about throughout your own personal experience, but also in your book and also in our interview today, because we are women, we're designed to give birth. The majority of births are low risk. And that means that I love when you read from different perspective, right? As opposed to the doctor coming in to deliver the baby. It's like the midwife comes in to catch the baby. Because I did the birth thing 3 times, like I said, in my house, and I did the work. Okay. No one delivered anything. I even caught my own babies. So I'm just saying that
hell yeah,
it's ridiculous. Even the way we talk about birth, because again, it's similar to something you said earlier on, which is that you just, if you're speaking about it this way, it's like you don't even know what it is. Like you don't even know what it's supposed to look like. You don't even know what's really going on here. And one step at a time, I feel like we can educate women about what birth is supposed to be and put the power back in our hands. Because I am in full agreement with you that this is something we can do. And yes, there are plenty of exceptions to the rule. There's plenty of risky situations, but fortunately, as we record this, it is actually 2023. And just because we are acknowledging the power of women to potentially birth in their own homes or birth differently, whether it's in birthing centers, using midwives and doulas in different ways, right? Finding ways to make it less traumatic. It doesn't mean we're anti-medicine. It just means right? There's so many ways that we could marry these two worlds and have it be about empowering the woman. So hopefully that's a takeaway. As we start wrapping up today, I would love just for you to just share with us, for the woman who's listening, who tuned into today's episode, maybe got more that she was bit off more than she could chew, or was kind of taken down the rabbit hole by our conversation today. What would you want her to know, right? In terms of hope?
We can create human beings in our bodies and give birth to them. I mean, it just seems like magic, doesn't it? What's more powerful than that? It's inherently powerful. It's inherently beautiful. Humanity goes on because we can do this. And I just think that we can lose sight of that. We can lose sight of just the spiritual experience of pregnancy and birth. And I don't want us to, because I think that coming back to that idea, that power is so important. It's so important to just remember that this is such a powerful thing to be able to do. And what a gift that we can do it.
I love it. I love it so much. The book is Birth Control, The Insidious Power of Men Over Motherhood. Let us know where we can get the book. Let us know all the socials, all the places, what you're up to these days. Yeah, let us know all the things.
The book is available anywhere that books are sold. Check out your local indie. And I am Allie Yarrow on the socials, ALIYARROW.
Awesome. Well, I will be sure to link all the places. Thank you so much for such a rich conversation today. This topic is super thought-provoking. And as you can tell, I get all, I feel like it really brought out that emotion, which is necessary. That's why we do this. That's why we have these conversations. And I really hope that we attracted some listeners today who, similar to you, were kind of like, what? Because that's how we're going to change this. We're going to, you know what I mean? That's the only way. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for making this space for the conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/493. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Allison. It was just such an interesting conversation. And when I have conversations with women who have had birth in the traditional hospital settings, I'm often just really made aware of how different my experience has been. It often makes me reflect on how many things I've taken for granted and how many experiences I didn't have, how many things I didn't have to necessarily fight for. So just to give you a sense of what I mean, when you have your birth at home, you don't have to fight with doctors to delay the cord clamping or have someone rushing in to take the baby away and do all these things. You don't have to really make a lot of those types of requests known, because when you're in your home and you have your baby and you're attended by a midwife and a care person, a lot of those things just are not applicable because your care is right there. And the whole concept of bringing, having your baby at home is one where it is more intimate and no one is taking your baby anywhere because you're already where you're going to be. So it's not to say they don't have to weigh the baby and eventually cut the cord and, do the different checks that they need to do. But it seemed, at least in my experience, to just be a lot more, it's just not as urgent. It wasn't like anyone was like, this needs to be done within 10 minutes. You were able to have the baby, catch yourself, hang out for a little bit. Especially in my case, there wasn't any severe complications or any things like that needed to be attended right away. And so often when I'm just hearing these stories of women who've had a birth in the medical industrial complex, it's just very, very, very different. And for anyone who is wanting the kind of lowdown on my first 2 births, the full story, I will make sure to link a podcast that I recorded on the Doing It at Home podcast. And in that podcast episode, I really did break a whole lot of details down, things that I haven't necessarily talked about anywhere else. So I would say if you're wanting the kind of lowdown, definitely check out that podcast episode. So I hope that you enjoyed today's show, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend whenever you're tuning in. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. And that's a wrap. If you've been loving the podcast, then I know you'll love our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program. This is our 9-month immersive experience that will completely transform the way that you work with clients, allowing you to not only teach fertility awareness to your clients, but to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. We're starting again in early 2024. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/BAMLive to join the waiting list and be the first to know when registration opens up again. There is no program like this offered anywhere. Transform your practice in 9 months. Join the waiting list over at fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE.